they've actually done a very good job of hustling around the world to find alternative sources of feedstock. Some of the specifications of that feedstock is quite different, and so as a result, in terms of the refineries here, they're used to dealing with a certain type of crude oil, and now they have to deal with a sweeter type of crude oil, and some of that is an adjustment for the refinery. But we came away feeling pretty reassured that they've got good access to the feedstock, which is what's needed to do the refining here to get the product down to New Zealand.
But in terms of that hustling, what does that mean for price, though? Because it obviously means that the price is going to increase. What's the flow-on effect for us?
Yeah, look, so, job number one, as I've always said, is to secure supply, and, that's really important for New Zealand because we'll lose a lot of incomes and a lot of jobs immediately if we lost supply. Yes, it's coming at higher prices. In some cases, it's taking longer to get to the refinery, and it's obviously got higher transport costs as well. So, as you've seen even over the last 2 weeks, you've seen the price of diesel go down 55 cents and then probably bounce back a little bit, depending on what's happening with the crude oil price. So, prices will continue to fluctuate. The supply chain is adjusting, but yes, certainly prices are part of that.
Were there any trends that they were noticing? Like, for example, was there any sort of ballpark percentage figures on how much more that they're paying for that supply now, or any other trends that they've been noticing?
It really just differs by depending upon where they're getting their source from, and it's not consistent. If there's another 20 days to get the product around and rerouted around a different part of the world, obviously it's got higher transport costs. But also in the scheme of the total value of a shipment of oil, often it's quite a small percentage, to be honest, as well. So, there's no set rule about it because they're actually securing oil from lots of different places, whether it's from the US, West Africa, Oman, sometimes cases Peru, Chile, other places as well.
You talked about this relationship as a relationship that you need to look forward. So where do you see this relationship growing?
Yeah, look, there's huge opportunity on the trade side. Obviously, for us, we want to expand our business into Southeast Asia. That's why we did the ASEAN Comprehensive Strategic Partnership upgrade. That's why we've done the same with Singapore directly and bilaterally. And so it's a real opportunity to bring, this time, as I said, we've got good relationships with Prime Minister. Our ministers have been building relationships over the last 2 years. And this time we've done something quite unique. We've only done it with Australia, which is to bring 30 of our senior CEOs to sit down with 30 of their senior CEOs here in Singapore to think about how they can operationalise this comprehensive strategic partnership and find areas of collaboration and opportunity as well. So I'm really excited to see, and we'll report back in with them later on tonight as to what they've come to and what else they think they can do together.
You said that this is the start of what you hope to have other deals like this. So what other countries are you looking at potentially?
Yeah, look, what Prime Minister Wong and I spoke about was that, we've done something that's, genuinely a world first here. We've done a lot of that in our relationship with Singapore over a number of years, and this is quite an interesting feature of new trade architecture. And our question to each other last night over dinner was, well, actually, are there other partners or other countries that might be up for the level of guarantee and the high level of commitment that's required to do a deal like this that we might be able to bring into it? And if you think about the future of investment and trade, we've got 16 small countries that we've actually pulled together. We'll be hosting a meeting in New Zealand back in July, there's potentially a group of countries that might be interested in there. But again, it's got to work for both parties, right? And that's what the bilateral power of this, where we're providing food to a country that imports 90% of its food, but also we need pharmaceuticals, fuel and building and construction supplies at times as well.
When you talk about other countries, are you thinking more sort of like the Southeast Asia region? That would be where you'd probably look to first?
Yeah, predominantly. There might be other countries within the ASEAN set, but having said that, we also have deliberately worked with small economies through the FITP partnership that we've called, that Singapore and New Zealand have been very instrumental in forming. And Todd will actually be chairing the next meeting, our second meeting, to say, in that group you often find small countries that are actually more up for doing things a little differently and inventing some new architecture. That's essentially how the CPTPP started, with the P4, of which Singapore and New Zealand were the key architects of that. So we just want to keep innovating in the trading architecture. And I also think it's really important because in light of Trump's tariffs and something we don't support, it's important that we continue to model out how we can actually innovate and trade, modernise some of the architecture to make sure it's of the benefit for everybody.
And Nicola, ahead of this trip, you talked about wanting to get some real assurances from the fuel companies, but also sort of confidence that with what's going on in the Middle East and as supply dries up there, that they're looking forward and a sort of future planning. So what did you hear from them today about that?
Well, the first thing is practically they are already sourcing sourcing crude oil from alternative parts of the world, and they've had to adapt their refinery to cope with that. And that's been quite a significant engineering challenge because the sweet crude that comes from other parts of the world is different from the sour crude that they're used to, and they've had to really, production-wise, change what they're doing, and they've done so successfully. So that's a real proof point. The second thing is that they remain confident that they'll continue to source crude oil from alternative sources around the world. But ultimately it's a market. So their point is, for so long as they pay the price for alternative sources of crude oil, it will be available, they can transport it, they can get there. But they are conscious that if supplies diminish over time as reserves are used, that could put a pressure on price. So we knew that coming into the visit, that there are still pressures for so long as the Strait of Hormuz is closed. That creates a global supply pressure. That does remain the case, but these fuel importing companies are confident they'll continue to have supply.
And in terms of other costs, we've seen in recent days the shipping containers, the 27% hike in New Zealand on that front. How concerned are you about those costs being passed on to consumers and sort of the impact that's going to have down the line?
Yeah, look, I mean, as we said from day one, there's no doubt there'll be an impact on inflation and also on growth. And our job as a government is to make sure we minimise that impact as much as possible. And that's why you've heard us say very clearly we've got to keep an eye on the financial position of New Zealand for the long run and for the future, as well as trying to find the balance of supporting people in a temporary, timely, targeted way. So, there's no doubt about it. When you've got inflation in your input costs because of rising, fuel costs, there will be a hit to inflation and some prices. But, I think we are well positioned. It's interesting just, having spoken to a number of leaders even in recent days. I had the privilege of talking to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who's trying to broker a peace over the Hormuz Strait. I spoke to the Sultan of Oman and MBZ, the ruler of the UAE as well, and just getting a sense of what's happening in that regional dynamic within the Middle East and the real desire that we have to see a de-escalation, a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. That's ultimately what solves our problem here. Yes, there'll still be a bit bumpy as we come through a supply chain readjusting for when the strait does open up eventually. But that's really what our focus on is, to make sure we do that and then make sure that we're governing New Zealand in a way where actually some countries are struggling to supply, some countries are struggling to pay the bills, some countries have invested in huge subsidies that are causing huge pain and suffering now to their books, and we're trying to find that balance and be very sensible about how we deal with it.
Nicola Willis, after the discussions that you had last night and this morning, what would you say you are more positive about, perhaps before you arrived, and what would you say you're perhaps a little bit more worried about, particularly in regards to fuel? But
yeah, I think there's two things for me. One is more reassured that the refiners have been able to find alternative feedstock. It may come at longer duration to get to the refinery, and it may come with higher transportation costs, but actually the supply is there around the world. The world is adjusting to different sources. And I guess the second thing is, in my conversations with those regional leaders over the last 3 or 4 days, that there's a lot of trust to be rebuilt between Iran and the US in order to secure the peace in Hormuz Strait, which is what we desperately need to see. So, there's a lot of work going in from some key regional players, but we need to make sure that pushes on and actually gets done. And that's a real, that's about trust getting rebuilt, about a ceasefire being in place and a negotiation done.
And I'd say, look, I've been reassured about the adaptability of these global fuel companies and the fact that really New Zealand is in the front of their minds. ExxonMobil are very conscious that they're supplying fuel that helps our transport system operate, helps our economy operate, and they are very conscious of the agreement between our respective governments. That's reassuring to me. I think the second thing that is still very clear to everyone and prominent in everyone's concerns is that for so long as the conflict in the Middle East is sustained, that strait remains closed, it will continue to put pressure on the global price of oil and therefore on the price path for fuel in New Zealand. So it continues to be in everyone's interests globally that we see that strait reopen, we see that conflict end.
Minister, can I just ask you on that 27% surcharge that Joe was asking about before, have you been briefed on that specifically, on the flow-on effects that New Zealanders are likely going to face, and have you also been told of any other large-scale surcharges that have been put on any sort of New Zealand imports?
Well, we have been monitoring throughout global shipping costs, and we have been continually updated on the fact that we are expecting increases there. That will have a different impact exporter by exporter, and it will depend on their particular commercial arrangements as to what impact that has. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about the secondary impacts that come through to overall inflation. It's not just how much the petrol price increases, but it's how this conflict in the Middle East puts price pressure on across the board that eventually gets reflected in our economy. And that's why you're seeing economists reflecting that they expect inflation to go higher this quarter because of these secondary effects in part.
So
Minister, when you
broadening that out, you know, this is just one of what will likely be a flow of news of price hikes, right?
Yeah, look, I think on the export side we also have to remember that the goods that we're exporting are still in very high demand, and so in some cases that shipping cost is a small proportion of the total cost, and exporters continue to reassure us that they're finding very willing buyers internationally who want our products, who continue to value the safety, the assurance that comes with our products, and that will continue to be the case.
But I guess is that 27% increase, is that within what you were told as could be an outcome, or is that higher?
I'd been told to expect a range of outcomes, and that again, how that will flow through will depend customer to customer, arrangement to arrangement, and we can continue to expect that.
Was it as high as 27% though?
Look, I'd seen a range of different estimates.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that, you know, you can have a range of economic projections, but at the end of the day, it's about the duration of this conflict and how long it goes on for. So there's no doubt about it. You know, that's why I said, we said from the beginning, it's going to have an impact on inflation and also on growth. Our job is to minimise that impact as much as possible, so that when this crisis passes, New Zealand's in really good shape, so we can go forward and grow quickly.
There seems to be, we've covered quite a lot of these, but there seems to be like a genuine optimism and excitement today. Which is a bit different to how these things can be. That they're quite formative and rote. I was just wondering if you could expand on, if you could just expand on that a bit, like how it's been the last couple of days, and what feedback you're getting about the bits of the deal, and just the broader comprehensive relationship.
Look, I think for a lot of New Zealanders, you're sitting there watching your news, and you're actually seeing the world literally on fire, and you're seeing it in conflict, and you're seeing the rules-based system that we used to uphold being sort of upended. And that comes with huge amounts of anxiety and worry and concern. So I get that. We are definitely at an inflection point on global affairs. We can work together with other countries because we don't have power in that world, but we do have very good values and interests to make our case. But then within that context, it's about what we can control. And what we can control is leveraging the relationships that we've deepened and broadened over the last 2 years to do something like this, which we actually, fortunately did in October last year as a means of preparing for something like this. And unfortunately, we never imagined we'd need it in 6 months' time. But I think, for New Zealand, I look out in the world as troubled as it is. It's about our relative performance compared to other countries and how we navigate these crises. I get it. We're all over it, right? We've gone through the pandemic. We've gone through high inflation. We've gone through Trump's tariffs. Now we're dealing with this war in Iran. And it's frustrating for everybody. But it's about, we will get there. We will get on the other side of this. And New Zealand has a fantastic future. And I think, when I come here and I meet with their business leaders from Singapore and New Zealand today, this morning, we kicked off the leadership forum. I feel incredibly optimistic that we can do very well in the world. It's pretty simple. We have what the world wants, in terms of products and services. We have the values and institutions that many countries aspire to. We have abundant natural resources if we're prepared to use them in the right way. And ultimately, we have the best people in the world. So why can't New Zealand do exceptionally well for itself in the years ahead? And that's why I get very energised when you're out and about doing this, because you can see that there's a real opportunity for our country to do incredibly well. As difficult as it has been at home and as tough as people have been experiencing it here, but also all around the world.
When you're travelling, you're often representing the wider Pacific as well, and we know that Pacific nations are really struggling, even more so in some ways. So what are the conversations that you're having here with Singapore about how you might actually be able to help the Pacific widely? Yeah,
so I spoke with ExxonMobil about that just before, and they're very conscious of the fact that they supply a lot of our Pacific Island fuel comes either really through Fiji, predominantly as the regional hub. They're very attuned to that, and I reminded them that it has a huge impact on those countries, and they were very, very well aware of that. So I was actually very impressed that they had registered the need for the Pacific to be in supply. It may be small volumes, but it means a lot to a country if you can't all of a sudden power up a country. So they were very well registered that. I registered with them, but I was impressed that they had already clocked that well.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks team. Have a good day.
Great.
Thanks so much. See ya. See ya. Thank you very much. Thanks for doing that.
Real important issues around this topic. Absolutely, and I think it's the heat versus light issue. So I think if I give you some context, in places